So then we are back with more understandings from the time of the Second Tabernacle services are refined in the Aramaic English translation of the word. This translation comes from the original manuscripts of the prophets of the Israelic lineage. So then we can understand the time of the end as per Yeshayahu the prophet. We find layers of understanding of the spring feast, the autumn feast, and also the returning of the cities of the Messiah laid waste for many centuries. As we read then the completion of the spring feast and also the acts of the Spirit or Ruach HaKodesh, we find then also the writings of the Shilishim, and there is a section regarding Timothy. It's very important for us to filter what's going on with these Megillah or then these writings, because Shaliach Shaul was never a person related of taking for granted or taking credit for the work that was done. Let's try understand then what's going on and the importance of reading these scripture properly. Then he said, Shaliach Shaul, then obviously a worker on behalf of the Messiah, a testimonier by the desire of Elohim, after then the promise. Try to understand, the promise was the promise of Moshe or Moses, received then the understandings of the promise of the Messiah and the life thereof. Then Timothy, a beloved son, then understanding, try to understand this grace. Grace has got nothing to do with it. Simply means a time was granted for the understanding of the layers. And obviously mercy. Then peace from Elohim and from the Messiah. And then he states in the 3rd chapter of 2 Timothy that he thanked Elohim whom he served from then his forefathers with a pure conscience. This means he had the understanding of the instructions ever since he knew himself as a boy. Then he was making continuous remembrance of him, there is Timothy, in his prayers. When he used to get with the people, they would remind of themselves of then praying for this boy. Night by day. And he desires him. Understand then the trials and tribulations, that he may have some joy. This means, what is joy? Joy is when revealing the instructions and the revelation, people then are enlightened. Have you ever spoken the truth of the instructions and the person has then a quiet moment? As you understand, a person is then obviously understanding the instructions. But the situation is, most often, afterwards, people make mockery out of it rather than teaching further other people. This is what the Messiah was saying. When a person hears the word, then the word they understand for a moment, but they don't produce fruit. When people hear the truth, then comes a moment of a quiet moment, but then from then on, rather than staying with the truth and desire of knowing more of the truth, then they go to the other direction, showing the evil in them and making mockery out of it. This is what the Messiah was explaining as far as the many kinds of soil, the rocky soil, and then the sandy soil, and then the thorny soil, many kinds of soil. He does not limit himself of these. The understanding is there is obviously a set of understandings of the instructions, as then he was explaining. Some people would understand the layers and then with the furthering of these information somebody else. Some people are soakers. They're absolutely egotistic soakers. They only hear, and they are fat. Have you ever talked with a person that is absolutely religious scum, yet fat? But they don't give the information to somebody else. But they rather want to make their name rather than explaining what the Messiah explained. The Messiah, however, when he was obviously instructing Shaul via the Spirit, he then found Timothy. Timothy was then a soft mouth. He was somewhat weak. But then let's understand the content of it, because part of it is related with his personality. Though Shaul has mentioned, when you read from the regular translation, as you can then entice the spirit of Elohim, or excite the gift, this is absolutely crazy. You don't excite any kind of a gift. You read the instructions, then you gather around with other people and you then recite. You simply read. Read the whole instructions aloud so then people can hear the words. It is doing this very often. It's got nothing to do with the ability of Timothy of then excite the spirit, and then the spirit of faith or the gift in you. That's just crazy. People don't receive any kind of a gift. Those people involved with some sort of a gift of the spirit, they have familiar spirits. Those are evil spirits. There are thousands upon thousands of people, they name themselves prophets, and they have simply familiar spirits. And when they hear tabernacling, when they don't change, then they become scoundrels. There are people that are in some sort of a ministry for 30, 35, 40 years. Should they change? Absolutely. They should no longer exercise these kinds of teachings because they are placing credit on themselves. More so if they talk of a false Messiah. But then, he explains. He was reminding himself, there is Shaul, of your genuine desire for the understandings of these layers, the shadow prophetic events. Then he said that his grandmother Lois and his mother Eunice, they were very linked with the Word. This means they were most often during the time of Timothy. His mother used to read the instructions to him. So then the grandmother, they would read the instructions very often. So the young Timothy became very familiar with the instructions. And Shaul simply has mentioned, do understand that you have this ability, because he had heard so many times. But then he said, then force yourself. It does not mean that a person is going to have some gifting of some sort or any kind of a function by forcing. The forcing part of it is related with the reading of the instructions, having self-initiative reading the instructions. Some people are so lazy. They think, but I was never led to read. No, you are simply lazy. You have to make time for it. You don't wait around, sit around, scratch your rear the entire day expecting some sort of a divine desire to come into your mind so you can read the instructions. You have to make time for it. So then, when Shaliach Shaul was explaining this to Timothy, at some point, Timothy would then go out and do what Shaliach Shaul was doing. He was gathering his people, but then you have to have yourself trained and very versed in the holy instructions, because there are some very tough questions related with the laws of Moshe, the holy instructions, and then the understanding the Messiah had come. And they would no longer have then rely upon themselves of doing what the instructions were saying, because the Messiah had done his part. They had become dependent upon the Messiah rather than trying to make him equal themselves with him. Then at some point, Shaliach Shaul was frustrated with Timothy, because he tried, and then those old, in quote, foxes would come around and they would twist his mind around. Then he would return, then Shaliach Shaul very dismayed. And then Shaliach Shaul had again encouraged him once more. And then he would go out, and then he would return. So 1st and 2nd Timothy, you find then Shaliach Shaul instructing him, sending him, himself returning. Then complaining a bit, then Shaliach Shaul would reteach him and then would send him out again. And it is tough. Now, if you are speaking with an Hebraic person from the first tabernacle service, it's not very easy. But then explaining the Messiah has already come a long time ago, and he is then returning. Most importantly, at the time the holy cities are returning. Then, this reading, as far as Shaliach Shaul and Timothy, this is for our understanding, so then we don't do what Shaliach Shaul is preventing him. In other words, don't be lazy. Try to understand, Shaliach Shaul is mentoring Timothy. So then, not only he was very acquainted with the holy instructions, and Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov, and then Joseph, and then Moshe, and the holy instructions, Eliyahu, Yeshayahu, and the prophets. But then, when the Spirit had come, so then the people would be aware of the holy functions, rather than the regular sacrifices done for so long, for more than 1,000 years. But then he would start talking with them, and then Timothy couldn't get over it. But when Shaliach Shaul was around, then the job got done. But sometimes people don't have the drive. These people are in a mental state, in a spiritual lazy state. They go to those churches, they think they are going to be entertained. They think if they sit around and they listen and they want to have some sort of a pleasure. They want to be pampered, speaking nice words of them. Then comes, in the second chapter, as a person is a soldier, speaking of entangles himself with the cares of this world. That's a big one. How many people they have some sort of desire for learning the holy instructions, and they are caught in the midst of either a family or a husband or a wife. Either the husband is lazy or the wife is lazy, does not want to learn. Either or, they get the instructions, the other is not interested. Then they go out and they want to carouse around. And when it's the time for the study of the scripture, person is not interested. That's the junk part of it, being in the midst of a relationship. And even if both of them would go together, and if they think they're going to be entertained, they lost their time. Congregations are not for being comfortable and then be in a position of being entertained. It's learning the holy instructions and then learning the layers and then explaining these so other people are then enlightened. Producing fruit. Then he explains, don't be entangled yourself with the cares of the world. Then obviously that he may please him who enlisted him. The husbandman who labors should be first then as far as the first fruit. The Messiah obviously was the wisdom. But then not only this, because we are during this time, and if people hear the words, and if they don't learn tabernacling, the Messiah gave the example as of a house that comes when then the waters come and the house goes down. Simply, a person then dies at the end. The soul then goes to torment. This is what the Messiah then in the Shilishim were preventing the people from. You can blame whomever you want. Point your finger, be angry. It's always somebody else. Then you have a name in your mind, and you name it and you blame. Shaul said, put those situations away. Read the instructions and renew the mind. Functions. Revelation is for revealed people. If a person reads Revelation does not understand, that person is not saved. And as far as this world, we understand this world is ending. Another 20 years, the very most, and then comes the autumn feast. Destruction of this world. Then people, they work so much for a house, for a family, and having a car and a dog, and the whole works is going to be absolutely burned. The Messiah said, don't be concerned when you are learning, when you have mostly learned. Don't be concerned with the destruction of the body. The body then will rot. People sometimes get sick, they die. But on behalf of the Messiah, when they learned and they instructed the people, they are being fruitful. At the end, those people are saved. The word in salvation is absolutely conditional. Must remain fruitful. It does not mean being perfect, but it means being fruitful. So then, Shaul had a lot of trouble with Timothy, because Shaul, as you read, he was trying to teach as much as he could, so then Timothy would take his place. But obviously he couldn't. Timothy, after Shaul was gone, he was not very productive. So what Shaul wanted, he couldn't get. When we read of Yohanan, and he was then mikvaing, or then baptizing the people in a river, he was doing very often, but he had his whole person. He was selected for this kind of work. When Miriam and Elizabeth, when they were then pregnant, both children then were limping. They had a work to be done. Then Yohanan was there. And as we read sections regarding then this particular area of the instructions, the word John does not exist in the Holy Instruction. It is Yohanan. Yohanan the Mikver. As he was then doing this very often, then the people of the law came around and saw him, and they saw the fruit. Yohanan the Mikver was producing fruit. People were changing. They were interested in learning the holy instructions. Then came the people of the law around, and they were asking some questions. And then later came a group of people and said, "Oh, Yohanan, those people that came around earlier and asked you some questions, they are baptizing themselves." Yohanan simply said, what kind of a fruit they can bear? They have to have then a specific understanding from heaven. They have to be selected to do this kind of work. Otherwise they won't bear any fruit. So the best way of understanding the instructions is coming around, for instance, Shabbat mornings or after lunch, and gather around and read the instructions. Then people, they take turns while they are learning. When the time comes, if a person is selected, then a person is sent away. But Shaliach Shaul, when he was trying to line up Timothy, didn't work. It simply didn't. Timothy was not the kind of a person with a drive for substituting his position. Though he tried many times. But the special position of Shaliach Shaul, he could not transfer. Shaliach Shaul was very special to do a type of work. Now, if you don't think you are a special person, be encouraged, because you can read the instructions and then be fruitful. Now, if you're expecting a lightning bolt to come from heaven and get into your mind, then to reprogram your stinking, lazy mind, then you can forget it. Reading the instructions must become second nature. If you don't make time for it, you won't be able to be fruitful. And if you read it from the Greco-Roman translation, then truly you are lost. Shaliach Shaul, then, he was involved with a trip. He went then to Cyprus. From then on, he ended up in the island of Malta. He was persecuted, he was tried. And he was explaining of a time of judgment. So much so that Felix then listened to him, and he was explaining then the holy instructions. Then the authority said, well, Shaliach Shaul, then this learning has come to your head and you are a bit crazy. And he said, not so much crazy as you think of. I do speak these situations with a sober mind, as these were not done in a corner. And then he said, you are very acquainted with these. Speaking of the authority he was speaking before. And you know these situations except for these chains. What he was trying to say was they were acquainted of what was going on, and they knew who the Messiah was. So then, there are more than 100 soldiers that went after Shaliach Shaul. Can you imagine the kind of understanding he had? And people can barely read a page during the day or at night. Then comes a very important section in Ephesians. Then explains the armor of God and so on and so forth. These situations are then very unique. As we understand, the spiritual world They have a specific step-by-step formations also. The spirit world is extremely scoundrelized. Explains then sections of these armor. This is an area that is extremely mishandled. Some say you have to have some sort of a shield and some sort of a sword and blah blah blah. You don't have to have any of it. The Messiah, he is the very person that knows how to defend himself. Shaul was simply mentioning of the guarding of the instructions, guarding the layers of understanding of the prophets and the instructions, guarding those. You don't have any kind of a power where you have to have a sword and a shield. These are simply nomenclatures used for the protection of the layers. Some people, they say in the spirit, because you saw in the spirit a person with a sword, and saw in the spirit, but the shield was so big. When I hear these people talk, it is absolutely scoundrels. They are perfect liars. Some of these prophets, they name themselves prophets. They go into those gatherings of theirs. I saw that person over there coming in with armor. Ugh, that is hard to puke. Worst yet, when people say they saw angels. Holy boy. And there are people 20, 30, 35, 40 years talking these kinds of junk. The northern part of the United States, it is notorious of having these kinds of people. There are thousands of them with some sort of a crazy familiar spirit where they observe some sort of either relationships, or then they observe angels in the spirit, or then they have some sort of a, Ephesians 5 in the spirit. Absolutely crazy, crazy, crazy. The region, they are hard workers, no doubt about it, but the spiritual side of it is, stay away from them. Some of these people, what truly get on the nerves of a person when hearing these kinds of scoundrels is then they say so plainly, because God has sent them overseas. God has sent them to another country. And when they got there, they saw in the spirit some sort of evil in the air or evil in the spirit world. And they make no mentioning of tabernacling. The spiritual fantasy island. And they not only deceive themselves, but then in the entire family of these people, they are absolutely taken by familiar spirits. Because that person over there speaks in a certain form, and then babblings when they come together. Shaul has said, if a person does not know how to talk in the spirit, if there is no interpretation of what they say, it's simply babblings. Shaul said, rather than be quiet until a person can interpret. But he is speaking from the people of the lineage. And then some of these prophets, they go around and then pointing the names of the people and explaining what's going on in their lives. Of course, they have familiar spirit. That's why the word familiar. They are evil. And then they lay hands on the people. Yuck. It's disgusting. People must be very aware of when they come together in these kinds of groups and they laugh and then next thing you know, people are laying hands on you and then reciting some sort of a junk. Stay away from those people. If a person not from the lineage understanding tabernacling, then don't let the person lay their hands on you. Otherwise, what you have is a transfer of demons. And there are those people who are simply crazy. They make such a novel out of the whole instructions. It's absolutely 100% crazy. And then they compare themselves with the Corinthians and Timothy and Acts. And they believe so strongly in what they have learned for so long, and then after 35, 40 years they understand, it was a fraud. Relearning the whole works. Then you have the travels of Shaul. Then you find him in many Megillas. You find him in Acts. Then you have Yehuda. Then you can read him in Yaakov. But Acts is truly interesting because it shows the primary works of Ruach HaKodesh, or the Spirit, and then schemes against the life of Shaul, explain when he himself was then on sea. So it's truly interesting reading, because as you read then the words of the Messiah, then you project of what then the Shalishim, or then the apostles, were talking. So then what the apostles, or then the Shalishim, they were saying, you make then a half a circle, a jump then from what the Messiah said, and then from the Messiah directly to the prophets. They must link up some way, at some form. And then there are those pastors and teachers extremely rich. They are so rich, they are filthy. fat and filthy rich pastors. Drive in a new vehicle every year, stay in the best hotels, the best suits, the best shoes, the best this and that and the other, mesmerizing thousands upon thousands of people. And speaking of God, if he was his neighbor, for some reason, I never liked pastors. I've talked with them, but most often than not, I didn't like them. Always felt in the spirit there was some sort of a rot coming out of it. Couldn't point my finger of what it was, but always uncomfortable with their teachings. Except a very few. The rest of them were evasive, cocky, slimy, replete with self-importance. Always as if a person, oh, don't waste a lot of my time because of your presence, sort of thing. Conversations were mostly fugitive, was always uncomfortable most of the time. And then listening wasn't very easy either, because they used to give behavioral lists. You should do this, then the other, shouldn't do this, then the other. They would explain why you should do this, shouldn't do the other. But the outcome of the conversation was always dry. Neither a person should be a total atheist. As we read then, for instance, Hebrews, we understand then Shaliach Yohanan was obviously involved. Then we had updates of the holy instructions, so then his people would perform the 1,000 years of the Messiah with no flaw, because they were dealing with tabernacling. Later we must explore these areas, because there is sections of Hebrews extremely important. So then when a person speaks of the holy instructions, people can be enlightened. So please stay tuned, much more coming up.